All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Joyce Lee. I'm on the Life Sciences Solutions team here at Datavant. I'll be your host for today. Today, we are hosting Florent Moise, a Managing Principal of Data Strategy at ZS, and together with Varun Mangamori, our Head of Life Science Solutions, they'll be discussing how the use of data is evolving in the biopharma industry today. And really talking about what's the next frontier for how to use all of the real world data that's constantly being generated. We are going to be focusing specifically on the value of bringing data together from different parts of the organization, as well as third-party data sources, and how to link that together at the patient level, which is something that we're seeing a lot of interest in from our clients recently. And we'll be able to share some real-life examples of how this approach has been applied to benefit patients, both in the clinical and the commercial space. So again, welcome everyone who has been joining just over the last minute or so. We'll get started in just a few seconds here. A couple of housekeeping reminders. If you have questions, you can feel free to submit them at any time throughout the presentation using the Q&A box in Zoom at the bottom of your screen there. And we'll get to answering those questions live towards the end of the session. All right, so with that, we can go ahead and get started. I'd love to have our speakers introduce themselves briefly. And Florent, maybe you can go first. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you just take a moment to tell us a bit more about your background and your responsibilities at ZS?
Sure, thank you so much, Joyce, and thanks to Datavant for inviting me for this webinar. ZS is a consultancy firm focused on life science. We have about 8,000 people working mostly with pharmaceutical companies on R&D and all types of commercialization issues. But most of our work is around data and analytics. I've been at ZS for around 18 years. I'm, as you said, managing principal for data strategy and partnership globally. This includes working with our life science clients on data strategy, from operating model to data sourcing, generation, all issues of data management and value creation, and of course, compliance. But also for ZS's own account, I act as the CDO. So my team works to scan the data landscape, build relationships and partnerships with all types of data owners and providers so that we can use this as part of a project. I also oversee compliance for these activities. We have a global team covering North America, Europe, and Asia.
Great, thank you so much, Florent. Varun, can you say a little bit about yourself as well?
Sure. Thank you, Joyce. And thank you, Florent, for joining us today. First off, for those of you who are not familiar with Databand yet, we provide technology that helps organizations link the health data that they need while protecting patient privacy. And I head life science solutions at Datavant, so oversee all use cases that we're enabling for our pharma and med device clients. And over the past few years, we've been seeing an increasing use of data linking at our clients, and I'm excited to talk about the new developments, examples, best practices, and learnings. Prior to Datavant, I spent about 8 years in life sciences consulting, mostly helping pharma and med device companies implement and deliver analytics-based use cases. Excited to be here with Florent to share some of what we've learned.
Great, thanks, Varun. So I'll turn it over to Florent now to kind of get us started and frame up the current state of real-world data. So Florent, can you kick us off?
Sure, absolutely. So as we all know, drug development and commercialization is very complex. It requires many functions: basic research, clinical trials, market access, marketing, sales, and so on and so forth. And each function requires access to different types of data. Now, we are blessed in life science with many types of data. Traditionally, most companies have been using RXs and claims, moving to EHR, clinical trial data. But there's a lot of new emerging data sets around social determinants of health, digital biomarkers, all types of genomic information that is being used across the different functions in life science. And so the big challenge that we're facing is that the data is available, It has increased in quantity coverage, but also in terms of velocity. We all remember the monthly data tapes that were coming in, then it moved to weekly. Now we're talking about daily information and very soon real time thinking about health apps. As a background, the healthcare system is generating about what is called a zettabyte. It's actually 1 trillion gigabytes of data annually. And that's not even taking into account the health apps. Another way to say it is that it's doubling every 2 years. So about 50% CAGR. And this is only accelerating because of COVID. What this has created is a situation where there's the number of vendors and sources has dramatically increased over the past 5 years. Again, due to the digitalization of healthcare and life in general. The challenge, though, is that the data is scattered across many different systems. You can see all the logos here. This is a Datavant view of it. We have at ZS, we also track the different data sources, and our view is very similar. And there lies the issue. The data is available, but it's definitely scattered across many different companies. So Joyce, I think you had a poll question for us. So the poll here is, what type of real-world data do you commonly utilize?
All right, so we'll just give it a few more seconds for everyone to put in their answers. Great, thank you so much, everyone, for participating. And let's see what the results are.
So I see here we have a lot of people using medical claims. I think pharmacy claims also 60%. I was expecting even more. Electronic health record, which is good, is coming as a not so distant third. But we can see that even things like digital biomarkers, genomic data are not widely used right now. And I would suspect that part of the problem is this fragmentation of data. So we can actually talk about this. Joyce on the, yeah. So the issue here is that we are life science professionals, but we're also patients. We're consumers and we're citizens. We care about our privacy and definitely compliance with HIPAA in the United States. Healthcare, as you know, is very heavily regulated when it comes to data for very good reasons. And our life science clients, life science companies care deeply about compliance and typically get the data in a de-identified way. So traditionally, each data provider has had its own de-identification and tokenization scheme, which means that Jane Doe from a claims dataset comes in as AA01, but when we look at it from a lab perspective, she comes in as CC01. And without linking the data together, it's impossible to get a holistic and longitudinal view of the patient. We also call it patient 360. Now, as I mentioned this, I want to put a few caveats to the situation that in the long run, some of those challenges may be solved by the CMS and ONC interoperability initiatives, which are great, but we're not there yet, and adoption is not a given. At the same time, there are some data aggregators, such as Symphony Health, who have made great strides in incorporating claims and EMR systems. And so we're seeing this integration happening. However, it's not happening fast enough for the application that we're looking for.
Thank you, Florent, for so eloquently describing the problem that companies are grappling with. Now I'll speak a little bit about a way to solve this. How do you really solve the problem of the fragmentation in health data? One way is to have a unified tokenization and linking solution that gets deployed at each of the healthcare data sources of interest. So having the same token enables you to get a longitudinal view of the patient while keeping the underlying data de-identified and HIPAA compliant. This allows you to to, in the previous example that Florent was talking about, ensure that the Jane Doe who's recorded in 3 different data sets is identified by the same token. You wouldn't know who the person is exactly, but you would know that it's a single person and be able to link that data and get a full picture of the individual. So we at Datavant have done exactly this over the past few years. So our focus has been to try and be the language that connects all of these different healthcare data sources. So over the past 3 years, we've built the largest linkable real-world data ecosystem in the US. You will see on the slide some of the highlights that we have here. We have majority of the claims data sources, payers, labs, and EHR data sources. But other than this, we also have a large number of more specialized data sources that haven't traditionally been part of either aggregators or data vendors that are part of the Datavant ecosystem. This includes things like mortality data, a large number of specialty pharmacies that give you visibility into specialty drugs that are being distributed, a number of academic medical centers and providers of social determinants of health data. So how does this data get used, and how can pharma companies really benefit from having all of this data available on a common single token? So we're beginning to see companies deploy this technology to de-identify data silos within their organizations, and then link these data silos to third-party data assets for various use cases. I'm going to talk through 3 examples here of how companies are crafting fit-for-purpose data assets to address some of the questions that they have. So the first one I have here is to talk about how safe and effective is a particular therapy. Now, historically, the only way to arrive at this or to address this question was to actually run a clinical trial. And we all know how time-consuming and expensive clinical trials can be. What you're now able to do by having a common token or a common link between different data sets is actually link clinical trial data sets to electronic health records or link them to lab data to get a much fuller picture of the patients who've been part of a clinical trial. The second example here is to understand issues of patient non-adherence and why they may be switching to other brands. Historically, you might get a picture of non-adherence through claims data or EHR data, but with a large number of drugs increasingly being distributed through specialty channels, the visibility that you have nowadays for these specialty drugs is fairly low with just claims data. What you're able to do with a common, again, token across these different data assets is link the specialty pharmacy data to claims, to patient support program data, to social determinants, to really understand what is the overall adherence that you're seeing with patients, and then identify whether patient support programs, social determinants are causing either issues with adherence, and how you're able to design interventions to improve adherence of patients. The last question here is around cost effectiveness of a therapy. You would traditionally do this just with claims data, but that might not give you the fullest picture of the clinical outcomes for patients. And so by being able to link data sets, you are able to link claims to lab data, to mortality, to understand exactly what is happening to the patients who've been on your therapy, and using that really create a fuller picture of what the overall outcomes for these patients are. So with this said, let me talk a little bit about what are some of the learnings that we have when it comes to linking data. This is something that we've done over the past few years with our clients, and a few things jump to mind when we think about how we've done this successfully. So the first thing is to source and find the right data. It's important that the data strategy is tailored to your therapeutic area. You might not get a general claims data set might not give you the in-depth view that you might need for your specific therapeutic area. So really look at what data set out there is going to give you the best view of patients with the specific indication. And for instance, if you have an oncology drug on the market and you're trying to look at overall survival as an outcome, having accurate mortality data and having that linked to specialized oncology healthcare providers can be really helpful. And so you should try and look at what's the best data out there for your specific problem. The second one seems pretty obvious, which is to assess the overlap correctly. The benefit from linking multiple data sets together mainly comes when you actually see the patients across all of the data sets that you're linking. But sometimes with different data sources out there, it can be hard to find data sets that have a common patient. So it's important to identify in advance which are the data sources that have a good amount of overlap of the patients that you're looking to study, and then either purchase or license in that data set that will help you answer that question. The last one comes as a little bit of a surprise to some of our life sciences clients. This is a very important step in staying HIPAA compliant and staying protecting patient privacy. This is an important step, especially as you're bringing in multiple data sets together, because with every new data set that you bring in together, the risk of re-identifying the patient increases just a little bit more. And so you have to ensure that whenever you bring in and link in data sets, it's important to make sure that the final data set that you have is certified as de-identified. And that's the way you to protect patient privacy and stay compliant with HIPAA. The easiest way to do that is to make sure that whoever you're getting the data from has a robust process in place for certifying the data set as HIPAA compliant, or you find an expert certifier who will do that for you.
Thanks so much, Rod. I can't re-emphasize more the need for certification and the need for expert determination here, and try to dispel a little bit the myth that when one can just merge all data sets together without, I guess, checking that there's no re-identification risk. One of the additional tip I would give here is that it all depends on the data sets, but it also depends on the fields that you're bringing in. And so when you work on those data sets and bring them together, you really have to think about what are the fields that are going to be important, what are the trade-offs that I can make. Perhaps I don't need all of the different fields because that will lead to higher re-identification risk, but I limit it to what's required for my study. So there's a bit of a temptation of getting everything. Unfortunately, you need to work with the expert determination companies or methods to figure out what's really needed.
Thank you, Flora. That is definitely important for our clients to do. So we'd love to jump into a few examples of how companies are buying linked data sets. And before that, we have a quick poll question for you. So how are you most commonly using real world data? And the poll should pop up any second now. You can select multiple options here. So please feel free to select as many as you're doing.
All right, so we'll just give that a few more seconds. Okay.
All right. Far and ahead, understanding the patient journey seems to be the biggest use case, followed by market sizing and health economics and outcomes research. I think it's not too surprising. The commercial side of pharma has traditionally had more data sets that they've leveraged and analytical tools at their disposal, and getting a full understanding of the patient seems to be the primary goal of a lot of these analyses, followed by understanding what the outcomes are, who are the physicians who are treating these patients, etc. I see that the three development use cases have probably the lowest users here, but we are seeing more and more companies leveraging real world data for clinical development use cases as well. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those in the slides to follow. So as I said, there's value for linked data across the life cycle of an asset, right from clinical development to launch and actually growth and maturity of these products. I won't talk about each of the points on this page, but would love to hear if you have any questions about it. We're happy to answer that at the end of the webinar. A few examples that I'll highlight. So at the clinical development stage, a few areas that we're seeing more and more uptake of linking in real world data is understanding what's the optimal protocol design for a clinical trial and identifying the right sites. And the second is actually during the conduct of the trial itself to bring in external control arms to understand how your specific drug is comparing against standard of care or placebo using real world data as the comparator. When it comes to drug launch, I think a lot of companies are looking at understanding really what is happening to the patient journey right now, as a lot of you highlighted as the main use case. Understanding who the prescribers are, at what stage should you talk to prescribers to get patients onto your specific therapy. RWD is also being used to compile evidence from trials and link it to real world data to support payer value discussions. And then we're also seeing uses of tokenizing clinical trial data and monitoring the safety of patients post-launch. So really long-term safety tracking, which becomes especially important in the current context with COVID trials. When it comes to growing in mature brands, I think really understanding more about patient adherence and developing interventions and patient support programs to help patients stay on therapy, and then tracking long-term outcomes to further develop the value proposition for physicians and for payers has been an important area. So I'm going to move into some of the specific examples we've seen. As I mentioned, please feel free to ask any questions you have in the Q&A. We'll get to them at the end of the webinar. So one of the examples that we saw in the clinical development space is trying to construct a synthetic control arm for an oncology product. So the pharma company we were working with was interested in a synthetic control arm because it was a small patient population. And they were looking at 3 different oncology clinical data vendors who would be able to supply the required fields that were needed for the control arm. The issue was that neither of the 3 data sources had sufficient N of patients to power the control arm for the study. And they had to rely on figuring out a way to link all of the 3 together to reach the N that they needed to conduct the study. But as they explored the options of how to do this, they approached us, and we were able to tokenize all of the 3 data sources, have the 3 data sources share data with the Databand token to the pharma company, which was then able to link the data sets together, deduplicate any patients that were covered at all of the 3 data sets, and create a true control arm, so to speak, that they're going to run against their experimental drug arm. So the next example that we have is more of a drug that's at the launch stage. This pharmaco had a rare disease treatment that required confirmation of diagnosis with a genetic test. Due to the nature of rare diseases, as you might all know, the pharmaco was interested in identifying more patients that might have the disease and be eligible for the therapy. So what we helped them do was link in clinical data, claims data, and genetic testing data, which allowed them to develop lookalike models for the patients to identify among the undiagnosed and misdiagnosed patients that might be out there, which of them might be likely to have the genetic mutation, so that their physician could prescribe the genetic test, and then once the diagnosis was confirmed, start them on treatment with the drug. So this helped them identify a number of new patients, which improved outcomes for the patients and also improved the commercial prospects for the drug. The last example that I will cover is about a drug about a drug that's in the mature stage. In this case, what we helped a company do was link in specialty pharmacy data, claims data, and their patient hub data. What's important here, and I think one of the novel things we've done is actually bring in specialty pharmacy data, which can be hard to get from traditional claims. And this is the only way you can sometimes get a full view of patients who are taking your drug. And by linking it to claims and patient hub data, we helped the company understand what was happening to adherence to medication overall. So what was patient drop-off on therapy? Were there certain segments of patients who were not taking the required number of doses, etc.? And then really help them pinpoint issues in adherence and see how specific patient support initiatives were helping patients. And then on the basis of that, redesign or create new patient interventions that would help patients and support them through their treatment journey. So with that, let me hand over to Florent, who's going to talk about one more case example.
Thanks so much, Varun. Before we do that, I want to take a little bit of a step back and talk about why ZS and Datavant. At ZS, we work with pretty much every type of data that you can think of and many data technologies. We maintain great relationships with all types of data providers and technology companies. And frankly, we're quite agnostic to the data source. We also use different types of tokenization technologies as needed and requested by our clients. That said, we have a fully managed service that we propose to our clients of integrating specialty pharmacy data. And we use this tokenization internally. We did evaluate a lot of different technologies and selected Datavant for multiple reasons. The first one is that we very much like the vision and the idea of a tokenization engine that would be independent of the data. The second thing we liked is the network of data sets that is already available. It brings us two things. One is the effectiveness. There's a wide network of sources which provide great diversity to fit all different types of projects from R&D to commercialization. And the second one is the efficiency. Because everything's already connected, when we start a project, we just need to turn on the spigot because the pipe is already there. In our prior settings, we had to work with the different data providers, install the software, etc. And this can save weeks on a project, which is relatively thin margins. And the last piece, obviously, is the support that we got from Varun and his team. And I can only say good things about the people that we interact with at Datavant. So maybe we can get into an example of some of the work, Varun, on the next page. So Varun talked about different point projects, point solutions. Here, what we have is an example where a pharmaceutical company wanted to have this as a capability. So their product is distributed through specialty pharmacies. And the goal was to create a 360 view of the patient across the different settings. So normally, each specialty pharmacy has its own system with patient IDs, etc. So when we first receive the feed, we make sure that the feeds are coming with the same tokens from Datavant, and we aggregate this at the specialty pharmacy level. Then it gets merged with one of the leading claims data sets, Symphony Health, again using Datavant token. Of course, everything, as we discussed before, needs to be HIPAA certified, but the result is a comprehensive view of the patients that can help across all types of applications, whether it's a patient journey, potentially incentive compensation, HEOR, clinical trials, next best action engines. So this is really a capability that is used by a pharmaceutical company, again, versus a point solution. We do have other cases, by the way, where we also integrate patient support services to look at awareness campaigns, adherence, program effectiveness measurements, and so on and so forth. So we have a poll question for you is, in the context of specialty pharmacy data, what are the data types that you'd be most interested in linking? So I see obviously medical claim, electronic health records, and obviously social determinants of health is another big driver of adherence. We did actually quite a few studies on the impact of social determinants of health and consumer data when it comes to adherence, for example. But I think this is a pretty good representation of what's possible with the Datavant technology. So as a closing thoughts, ZS started about 38 years ago, focusing on analytics and algorithms, and we've been doing a lot of analytics before it was cool to do analytics. Always been on the forefront of data and analytics on life science. As I mentioned, we've seen a dramatic evolution of data and technology. Lots of new use cases. We're very excited by what lies ahead and the potential to get through new data, find new therapeutic options, improve physician supports and patient care. As mentioned earlier, the big challenge here is that one data source or one data vendor cannot deliver everything. And we believe that the ability to integrate the data from different sources, external obviously, but also internal sources that are available within life science companies, is becoming a critical capability for R&D and commercial purposes, of course, in a privacy compliant way. As we build data strategy for clients, this is one of the core capability on the roadmap. Now, it will require experimentation. It requires a lot of change management, innovation, and more importantly, integration between different functions within pharmaceutical companies, IT, business, compliance, legal, etc. So there's a lot of work beyond just bringing the tokens together to really make this a capability to better patient care.
And I'd just say that given the shifts that are happening in the overall landscape, always think about what's the best data sources you want to bring in to answer your question. You don't have to rely on what you've used in the past, and then really link them together. Think about what's the best insight that you can get out of linked data. And you can do that with a unified tokenization engine that can help you stay HIPAA compliant while linking this data, building fit for purpose data assets that can answer these questions. Thank you for all of your time and listening to us. I'll hand over to Joyce and we can get into the Q&A.
Great, thanks so much, Varun and Florent. So we'll turn it over now to our audience to take some of the questions, and there's been a bunch coming through, which is great, so keep those coming. And as a reminder, you can submit them through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So why don't we start with this first one that came through, kind of related to it looks like kind of the Datavant ecosystem of data. Did all of the data providers agree to kind of combining all their data into this data lake, and how did you kind of make that happen? So maybe Varun, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, that's an important question. So one of the things that we really focus on at Datavant is that we're not an aggregator or a marketplace, and we want each of the data providers to maintain control of their data. So they need to sign off when their data is being used for a particular use case, because a lot of these data aggregators and sources have restrictions on how that data can be used. So we're not in the business of trying to bring everyone's data together into one common data lake. What we're trying to do is deploy the software that helps partners make their data linkable and actually link that data and share it to customers. So what we've done over the past 3 years is really deploy this software behind all of our data sources firewalls. So we don't see the data, it doesn't sit in our data systems. All of the data owners still control all of their data, and that's what they like about the Datavant model, and that gives them the freedom to engage with whoever's interested in using the data to share the data with them and make it available for various use cases.
Sorry, Varun, I wanted to add one thing, that I think from a life science company perspective, it's also reassuring that they have control, and this can be brought, providing that you have all the relationships, and Datavant can help with that in helping doing the introductions, etc., and look at the landscape. We also at ZS do landscape scanning, but the point being that After this, you can go and contract directly with individual providers and bring the data inside your walls, such that you have full control over what you're doing. There's no limitation, basically, that would be based on the Datavant token. However, the benefit is everything's already linked.
That is definitely an important point. And I think when we speak to our data sources, this is one of the reasons why some of our specialized data sources mention that they are only comfortable with this sort of a model. And this is why they're comfortable with linking their data and making it available for use cases, but they don't want to give up control of their data.
Great. So maybe this next one I'll tee it up to Florent. This question is about asking, would you be able to characterize the regulatory and compliance challenges that your team has faced while trying to link data sets?
Sure, absolutely. The challenge basically lies on re-identification, the risk of re-identification. I will caveat by, I'm not a lawyer, consult your legal department, etc. But the idea is, if you have enough information about an individual that even if it's tokenized, you can figure out pretty quickly who that individual is. And of course, you have all the information that is available with healthcare, so all your RXs, etc. But once you start adding personal information such as age, gender, income, or any types of social determinants of health, the risk of re-identification increases dramatically. There's a statistical formula to evaluate that risk based on the uniqueness of the data fields that you get, as well as the population that you have. It occurs quite often in rare diseases where you start having those issues because there's only one or two patients in that zip code or that state sometimes. And so the certification companies will work with you to figure this risk out and be able to tease what are the fields that you may want to trade off. One of the live examples that we did even within the context of ZS is we're trying to link a big claims data set to a lot of social determinants of health information. We wanted to run some internal experiments, and this banged directly into this issue. And so we had to start selecting a little bit more instead of building a gigantic database. Think about what are the ones that we need for a particular use case.
Right. And maybe that's a good kind of segue into another question that just came in a couple of minutes ago, also related to certification. What is the average time that you're seeing to obtain de-identification certification? Is this done with an expert or software? Is it possible to obtain blanket de-identified certification for certain data source type linkages, or suggest similar approaches to expedite the process? So it looks like it's kind of asking about, current state and, what's possible to kind of accelerate. So Florent or Varun, I don't know who wants to jump in first on this.
I'll start it off, but I know, Varun, that you guys at Datavant have developed specific solution. But I think the de-identification process, it can be lengthy and used to be lengthy because it used to be run more as a small shop by different outfits. The good news is that over the past few years, there's been obviously a lot of focus on this, and there's been quite a few companies that have started professionalizing the field and making those software run in their environment. And I think now some of our partners are thinking about running the software in the client's environment. Varun, maybe you want to talk about the partnerships that you guys have with Mirador?
Yes, that's a very timely question because we just signed a partnership with Mirador Analytics, an expert determination certification provider. Typically, the answer used to be prior to this that, as Florent described, it depends on how many data sources you're bringing together, the capacity of the expert determination firm. currently we still have to rely on an expert to do the analysis. But with the partnership that we have in place with Mirador, we're trying to automate a large part of the processes that happen. So for common linkages between claims in EHR or say claims in lab data, where you know the types of fields that are going to be joined, we're trying to come up with pre-certified layouts so that you don't need to go through a lengthy process to obtain certification for your joint data set. For specialized linkages where you have a number of data sets linked, we still think that it's important to make sure the expert has sufficient time to go through the process and actually certify it. But we're trying to make the process as streamlined as possible for the common linkages, and having a software integrate the experts' processes is definitely the way forward, is our belief.
And what we're talking about these days, Varun, is more weeks and in the lower number. We're not talking about the months that
Yes.
we had many years ago.
Totally. And so the typical timeline now maybe looks like for common joins, it can be less than 24 hours. And then for more complicated joins of data, it can be up to a week or maybe a little bit longer. But our aim is that once you have a common couple of data sets that are linked, we try and get you the certification in under 24 hours.
And maybe we'll squeeze in one more kind of follow-up question here that came through. Does each data use need to be recertified as new data is aggregated?
So every time new data is linked in, it has to be recertified. If it's the same data that is being used for a different use case, then you don't need recertification because it's still the same underlying data, and the risk of re-identification is on the combination of data sets that are linked. So, but each time you add in a new data set, you need recertification.
Great, thanks, Varun. So just wanted to note, there's a lot of questions coming through. We'll try to get through as many as we can, but if we don't have time to get to your question, we'll follow up with you separately after this session is over. But please do keep them coming. This is great. So maybe we can kind of switch gears. There's a bunch of questions kind of coming through on different use cases. So this first one is asking, how can pharma companies market to anonymous patients once they have the data connected?
So maybe I'll take this one, Joyce. You can't necessarily target, obviously, the individual patients, but there are multiple avenues to use this information. One is if you happen to have claims data that has the physician identified, then you can potentially have use any type of next best action engine or potentially rep promotion to go and discuss with this physician opportunities for a certain series of patients. The second piece is that you can connect this to more consumer-oriented marketing. I'm thinking about LiveRamp, and maybe Varun can tell you more about LiveRamp, since Travis, the CEO of Datavant, was also a founder of LiveRamp. But you can try to find avenues and places where those different patients are from a media consumption and target the advertising to these type of things. What you cannot do, though, obviously, is to attempt to re-identify anything. That obviously would be a big no-no.
Absolutely, Florent. And to build on the first angle that Florent talked about, the patient finding use case that I spoke about for the rare disease also at the end was identifying the physicians who are seeing these patients. So you don't know who the individual patient is. You can't identify the individual patient. You can go to the physician and say, hey, you're seeing someone that looks like this, might be a candidate for this specific genetic test, and have them take the test. The other side is, yes, you link to consumer data sets and create cohorts that you would want to advertise to or target as part of your advertising, but you can't target individual patients and advertise directly to them.
Now, there is one use case that is possible, which is you could potentially get to your target, the target part. You could potentially get using the de-identified data, a profile of potential patients that are of interest, and then use that profile inside a consumer data set but this is only a profile that would be applied to consumer data sets. It's not something where you can target an individual patient, but we've seen this happen quite, I guess, a few times, not that often.
Great, thank you both. So this next question is asking, can you share examples of how real-world data is used for long-term patient outcomes and patient support programs? So I know we kind of touched on an example earlier related to patient support programs, but I don't know if Varun, if you want to share a little bit more detail on some examples related to tracking patient outcomes in the long term.
Yes. So what we've seen is, and this is especially true in the case of oncology, really trying to understand the overall survival of patients becomes extremely important. And so some of the examples where we're helping companies do that is by linking in mortality data with whatever claims data or specialty pharmacy data they have to say patients who are on the therapy of interest, what is the overall impact on their survival? How does it compare against other drugs that are on the market, and can that help in, say, value discussions with payers or tailoring your own programs? The second part of the question, which is around patient support programs, what we're seeing there more is to understand, for instance, the impact of copay cards. So does the copay card actually have an impact on patient adherence? So by linking in your patient support program data with specialty pharmacy data, you can see for the cohort of patients who are using a copay card, is their adherence significantly better than those who are not using a copay card? So you can cut this by different patient support programs and really using that, understand what the impact is and whether you need to make any tweaks to your programs.
And to build on that, Varun, I think copay cards are just one example. What we've done for some of our clients is to look at multiple types of campaigns that happen from a patient support program perspective. So copay card is one, but there's a lot of all the different things that, and you can calculate actually the marketing ROI on those if you are allowed to by your legal department.
So let's see, maybe we can take this question on, can you give an example of real-world evidence and randomized controlled trial beyond safety trials?
Yes, so one of the examples that we're seeing is external control arms, where you bring in real-world data to form the external control arm for a randomized controlled trial. Where we're seeing this happen more is in indications where there is either a small patient population, so it's a rare disease and it may be hard to enroll the N that you need to power the trial that will determine whether your investigational drug is effective or not. And the other is where it might be unethical to put patients on a placebo when there's a standard of care already on market. And so you just want to compare against the standard of care patients, and you construct an external control arm using this. When I think about actually tokenizing the patients from a randomized clinical trial, there are a couple of other places where this is being applied, and I think that's more downstream, which is one is just tracking the overall safety of patients once the trial has been completed. The second that we're seeing more in the COVID time is because a lot of patients are missing their appointments and they're lost to follow up, you're able to track these patients without losing them by tracking them in real world data. And the third angle there is once you actually collect real world data information from patients who've been on your drug in the trial, you can collect the RWD to support your payer discussions even before you're actually generating data from the drug being on market, because you're tracking the patients who've been part of your clinical trial, and that is valuable data for you to have discussions with payers.
And Varun, while we're on clinical trial, I want to add two other cases. One is getting a good sense for the cohort and the potential patient pool. Oftentimes what happens is that our clients are not just looking at, say, an indication or an ICD-10 code, but it's an ICD-10 code with a lab value, with a genetic mutation, etc. And you can only do that by merging data sets together if you want to get a sense for if your protocol will be supported by enough of a patient pool. The second aspect is around clinical trial site identification. Again, one data set cannot support it all, so we use an accretive method whereby adding data sets on top of each other, you're able to get a much better view of the population and understanding who are the physicians that are treating them. And so we feed this into specialized tools to identify those sites that might yield the profile of patients that we're looking for.
Great, thank you both. So maybe we can take a couple of questions that are a little bit more of a step back in looking at overall trends. So the first one is, in pharma, where is the pull for more comprehensive real-world evidence in the short or medium term coming from? Is that from regulators, from payers, from providers? So where's the kind of the demand for real-world data and real-world evidence coming from?
I think, go ahead first.
I was going to say, I have a point of view. I feel like it is coming internally from pharma, because there's just a recognition of the amount of data there is and how that can help in various clinical and commercial use cases. With that, I think it's flowing into discussions with regulators and with payers. For instance, with regulators, the FDA is increasingly becoming comfortable with use of RWD or submission of data packages that involve RWD. And payers are more and more open to the idea of value-based contracts. I think it's still a small part of the payer-pharma relationship, but payers are increasingly becoming more comfortable with that. But I believe that a lot of the push is coming from pharma itself, realizing that there is a ton of valuable data out there and using that to leverage it for various use cases.
I would completely agree with you, Varun. Regulators, for sure, I think the FDA has been way more open than in the past on anything that's RWD. I think from a population health perspective as well, real-world data has become very, very critical because we want up-to-date information. I think COVID is only just demonstrating the need for that. But I also want to talk about the why pharma wants this type of data. A lot of the treatments that are being developed are complex treatments, lots of them on oncology. I mean, most of the drugs that apply just to one large disease are, I wouldn't say available, but they've been discovered. Now what we're after is relatively narrow indications. And if you want to get into those narrow indications, rare diseases, etc., you really need a way to target patients in a very fine way. And the only way to do this is actually to combine information, potentially curate physician notes. So there's a lot of, I think, the way we develop the drugs and the way we bring therapies to market is also now requiring all this real-world data, not only as evidence, but also for enabling the whole pharma ecosystem, whether it's on the R&D side, the trial side, or even on the commercialization side.
Great. And this kind of is maybe a good segue to the other question here on kind of overall trends. This question says, where do you see the greatest life sciences opportunity in terms of de-identified data uses? Where is the market headed? So Varun, I don't know if you want to jump in on that first, in terms of thinking of the biggest opportunity.
Yes. I feel like there's quite a bit of penetration already in use of the identified data on the commercial side. I think we're just scratching the surface of what is possible on the clinical development and the R&D side. I think there's more and more opportunities being unlocked there. The various stakeholders involved, including regulators, are more comfortable with the idea of using real-world data for R&D related use cases. And I think that's where we're going to see a phenomenal amount of growth. That said, I also feel like in the commercial side, use of real world data was focused on like a single data set used for just market sizing or targeting. A lot of the use cases tended to be focused on these types. And now we're seeing more and more complex analytics because you're able to link together and create really rich data sets. And so you're able to see the kind of machine learning and AI analytics that enable you to find patients, to understand where to intervene. So I think there is going to be a growth in that side as well.
And Varun, completely agree on the commercial side. What we are seeing is more and more clients developing patient prediction models using AI and ML technologies to perform next best action and seed commercial engines. So I would still say that there's still a lot of growth here. It's not nascent, but it's not mature yet, for sure. And then on the R&D side, in my mind, the biggest one is around clinical trials and being able to identify patients and reduce the cost of those clinical trials as much as possible and make them successful faster, I guess.
Yeah.
Right. So there's an interesting question here asking, are there any preclinical R&D needs that can be addressed by data linking? Florent, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, or
yeah, it tests a little bit the limits of my knowledge, but we have a team at ZS that specializes in preclinical issues. And I've been working with them a little bit. So the answer is yes, but then you're talking about different types of data sets. You're talking about going after genomics. You're talking about really linking population. There are much smaller data sets that are involved there, but the answer is yes, we've seen use cases there.
And we've had discussions with a couple of companies around this, and the focus is really to understand more about the course of disease, understand disease progression, how various genotypes affect disease progression, so that you can create more effective drugs and figure out what is the exact target population that you want to go for. So as Florent pointed out, the data sets that are being linked there are going to be much broader. So genetic testing data, a number of other data sets, but the patient populations that you might have for these data sets might still be on the smaller orders of magnitude. It's really the the depth of data that you go into on each patient that gives you these insights.
Great. So maybe I'll try to squeeze in one more question here before we wrap things up, kind of swinging back over more to the commercial side of things. You talked about, specialty pharmacy data and linking that type of data within your network. Can you tell us about what specialty pharmacies do you have or do you work with in your network?
Sure. We work with more than 25 different specialty pharmacies. And so we provide the linking technology for them to aggregate data. So wherever they're collecting patient information, we help them de-identify it, create a token so that they're able to share and link that data to other data sets depending on pharma company needs. And we also work with a number of the specialty pharmacy data aggregation companies like IntegraChain, ValueCentric, etc. And I think this is one of the strongest parts of the Databand ecosystem, given how many drugs are distributed through specialty channels. It's an important piece of the puzzle if you're trying to get a full picture of patients.
Great. All right, so I think we'll stop there for today. For those that we didn't have a chance to get to your question, don't worry, we'll follow up with you afterwards. But we'll kind of wrap things up there. So thank you everyone for joining and just contributing with all of your questions and comments. Thank you again to Florent and Varun for sharing your insights with us today, and to the rest of the ZS and Datavant team, Merwin, Megan, Justin, those behind the scenes who kind of helped to pull this together. So we've included contact information for both teams if you want to reach out to any of us individually with any questions. And again, we'll follow up with you separately for any questions that we didn't get to. And we will share around the recording to everyone who registered within the next day or two. So keep an eye out for that. And that does it for us. Thank you again so much. And thank you, Varun and Florent, for joining us. Appreciate it. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Joyce.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.
Bye.